Joshua Maddox walked out of his house and just vanished into thin air. For 7 years, everyone had given up on ever finding the 18-year-old again. Only he'd been less than a mile away from his childhood home for nearly a decade, trapped inside a chimney, and no one ever realized it. This strange, outrageous case quickly took the internet by storm, a head-scratcher that endures to this very day. And if we dig deep enough, we might just discover that Josh did end up there by some unfortunate accident. Josh might have just been another victim of a serial killer, a killer that's still very much a free man. Here's the story of Josh Maddox, the boy in the chimney. The boy in the chimney had a name. He was born Joshua Vernon Maddox, one of 4 siblings raised in Woodland Park, Colorado. Josh was a very talented musician that played many instruments, sang well, and wrote his own music. He wrote comic strips, short stories, and even full-length novels. But Josh was, like so many natural artists are, a dreamer. He always spoke of going on some great life-changing adventure, writing songs about his time on the road and in nature. Your typical head-in-the-clouds dreams of living life by his own terms and racking up all of the adventures that came his way. But Josh was a happy kid, and everyone loved him and his bright outlook on life dearly, even if it did sometimes cause him to space out of reality to live in his fantasy world. In 2006, when Josh was 16, his older brother Zach took his own life. Josh was utterly devastated and threw himself into writing and music with an almost obsessive need to fill the void. And if he burnt himself out, he'd go for long walks in the woods, sometimes even staying out there on his own, camping for a few nights at a time. It's not like he became morose. He was still full of jokes and dreams. It's just that Josh focused more on work and reflection than he had before. It's not like he ever just disappeared without telling people where he was. If he wanted to camp out for a day or two, his father would help him pack and even drop him off and pick him up at the agreed time. 2 years after Zach's death, Josh, now 18, went for a walk around the neighborhood on March the 8th, 2008. He told his sisters Ruth and Kate that he was heading out, and like he'd done a million times before, he walked out of the door for an afternoon stroll. When Josh didn't return that night, his parents were immediately worried, and rightfully so. Josh had never gone out without telling them where he'd been, and they'd never put any restrictions on where he could go or for how long. Josh had no reason to lie, nor had he ever lied or stayed later than he said he would. Still, they waited until the next morning, hoping that he'd just lost track of time. But when Josh still didn't show up the next day, they started calling all of his friends, but no one had seen him. By that afternoon, police and neighborhood volunteers were searching on foot, both in the town and in the surrounding woods. After 5 days of calling hospitals and homeless shelters and multiple searches, Josh was finally filed as a missing person. I wish there was more urgency to report here, but Josh was 18. Legally an adult. He'd suffered a life-changing loss, and well, he had always talked about going off on some great mysterious adventure. Many, the police included, believed that one day Josh would just randomly turn up with a wife and kids after living a few years in the woods, probably writing bestsellers under a pen name or something awesome like that. I don't blame them for concocting this vagabond life for Josh, without a scrap of evidence to suggest otherwise. And with the police shrugging their shoulders, this fantastical wish was a better alternative than something terrible happening to him. However, there were plenty of others that refused to believe that Josh had simply walked off. His father, Mike, never moved out of that house, even after he and Josh's mother divorced. He wanted Josh to be able to return home if he could, and Mike just never believed that Josh left of his own accord without any of his most prized instruments and drawing materials. But like I said, the mystery here doesn't lie in an 18-year-old dreamer vanishing off the face of the earth. It's the bizarro nature of how he was eventually found. August 7th, 2015, nearly 7 years after his disappearance, Josh's remains were discovered inside a chimney in an abandoned cabin less than a mile away from his home. You see, those woods that the neighborhood searched had a cabin in it that was built sometime in the 1950s. The property changed hands through the years, but during Josh's disappearance and the discovery of his remains, a man named Chuck Murphy owned the place. His brother lived there until 2005, but after he moved out, the cabin just sort of stood there, decaying with time. Chuck rarely went out there, mostly using it to store odds and ends in. Kids avoided the place because it was infested with raccoons and the occasional snake, and there was always a terrible smell around it, presumably from vermin that had died under the floorboards. Now that we know who was found there, well, maybe that smell wasn't a dead animal after all. In 2015, Chuck decided to demolish the place, which, let's face it, wasn't good for much else after being abandoned for all those years, to make room for an extension of the very neighborhood where the Madduxes lived. When the crew started taking down one of the fireplaces, they found the mummified remains of a young man with his head facing downward and in a fetal position, essentially folded in half to the point that his knees were beside his ears. He was only wearing a single thin vest and nothing else. Unfortunately, police were walking into a very difficult crime scene. Not only was the house abandoned for many years with all sorts of vermin and exploring kids going in and out, not to mention the occasional bums spending the night, the place was in its final stages of demolition. Half the rubble had already been driven to the dump, and there was no way of telling how much evidence was lost during the time that the cabin was being torn down. From what evidence was left at the ruined scene, they could tell that the chimney had been blocked from the inside of the cabin. A counter, meant for dining on, had been dragged in front of the opening. Now this is a counter built into the wall. Whoever put it there had to tear it out of the wall it was nailed to for the explicit purposes of keeping the fireplace shut. Next to the fireplace was a set of folded clothes. Chuck certainly hadn't moved the dining counter, and there would be no reason for anyone to put that amount of effort into moving it other than keeping something from coming through the chimney. Again, the perpetrator would have had to use the entry on the inside of the cabin. There's no way anyone's carrying an 18-year-old dead body up a roof just to throw him back down, now is there? If you were angry at the police's lack of, well, apparently any interest or attempt to even bother to do the bare minimum, you're about to get even more enraged. After Josh was discovered in the cabin, it came out that people had been calling in tips to the Woodland Park Police Station for years. Several of Josh's friends mentioned a transient 20-year-old that hung around town for a few months before the disappearance. Andrew Newman was an odd sort of fellow who traveled the country by hopping trains. He and Josh struck up a friendship, and the two even planned on going to New Mexico together after Josh graduated. That's partly why a lot of people thought Josh had just gone off to search for an adventure. They were seen together in the hours before Josh went missing, yet police never even bothered to question him at all, just like they hadn't made the time to speak to the owner of the cabin. Only in the days after Josh disappeared, Andrew bragged to several people that he killed Josh and no one would ever find his body. By the end of the week, he skipped town to go to New Mexico alone. Police received multiple tips about Andrew's claims over the years, and you guessed it, they never followed up on them and didn't bring Andrew in for questioning on the handful of occasions that he went back to Woodland Park to visit family. If they had, they'd have found out that Andrew wasn't some hippy-dippy, free-spirited dude who lived life on the move. He was downright scary. Besides a string of previous offenses, Andrew stabbed Anthony Schneider, a wheelchair-bound man, to death in New Mexico just months after Josh's disappearance. When he was arrested for the crime, it quickly became very clear that Andrew had some serious mental health conditions. He attempted to escape from prison and admitted to psychiatrists that he'd killed a woman in Taos and that he'd hidden her body inside a barrel. Gladys Garcia was indeed found inside a barrel in Taos, around the place that Andrew pointed out, and the dates matched up too. Ready to hate the New Mexico Police Department as much as the Woodland Park Department, they dropped the murder charge against Andrew when their only witness died unexpectedly, despite the fact that the knife used in the murder had Andrew's fingerprints all over it and he'd been placed at the scene by other people. The murder in Taos was never followed up on because police already had a suspect in custody and they had their hands full with the West Mesa bone collector serial killing case going on at the time, where 11 bodies were found in the New Mexico desert. The West Mesa bone collector is still an open case, so another serial killer just didn't fit into their schedule right then. Never, not once, was Andrew brought in for questioning for Josh or Gladys Garcia's murders. The Woodland Park Police absolutely refused to reopen Josh's case, and they've never charged him with Gladys either. Since then, Andrew's been arrested for burglary, possession of illicit substances, and even assaulting 3 police officers during one of those arrests. There is no mention of him being inside any prison or a court appearance that would have put him there. So logic would dictate that Andrew Newman, who by his own admission is a serial killer, is still out there somewhere. I don't know what's more frightening. The 2 separate police departments failed this happy, artistic kid who was going to paint the world with his bright ideas, that they failed Gladys Garcia and Anthony Schneider. Or both those police departments allowed this incredibly dangerous individual to skip through their fingers, free to kill someone else. The amount of sins committed by the people who are supposed to be protecting us had led to the deaths of 3 people. I wish I could say that police dropped the ball, but let's be honest here. They never even made the effort to pick the ball up to begin with. Unfortunately, chances are slim that the Madduxes will ever receive justice. But we can at least hope that Andrew will turn up somewhere before he hurts someone else. But one thing that I do know is that if you like, subscribe, and leave a comment below, it'll really help the channel immensely. I'm here 3 days a week, every week. See you in the next one. Cheers.